Well, hi there, everybody. My name is Jeff Mayers. I'm with WisPolitics.com and WisBusiness.com. So welcome today to our virtual luncheon, part of our trade policy series, the first one of the year, Decoupling the U.S.-China trade relationship, challenges and opportunities of a new economic order. This virtual luncheon is organized in cooperation with the Wisconsin Tech Council, in addition to the Center for East Asian Studies and Latin America, Caribbean and Iberian Studies. Those are both at UW-Madison. This is part of the Center for East Asian Studies East Asia Now series. It is also, as I said, part of the WisPolitics and WisBusiness.com trade policy initiative, which we are doing in cooperation with the Tech Council. That's sponsored by Michael Best Strategies and the Wisconsin District Export Council. Other partners of this effort include the International Practice Section of the State Bar of Wisconsin, the Madison International Trade Association, and the Milwaukee Chambers World Trade Association. So we have an all-star panel and a terrific moderator here. The moderator is going to be Tom Still. He's president of the Wisconsin Technology Council. And then we have Congressman Ron Kind. The congressman is a Democrat from La Crosse. He's a member of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. So he knows the ins and outs of trade, especially from the agricultural point of view. We have Professor Enrique Dussel Peters, and he's from the National Autonomous University in Mexico City. So welcome, Professor Peters. And then we have Professor Samantha Vortherms. She's a China expert at University of California, Irvine, and she's a UW-Madison PhD holder. So a welcome panel. Welcome, Tom Still. Welcome all of you for listening in. I'm going to turn it over now to my good friend and colleague, Tom Still.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and welcome to this really distinguished panel. And we're kind of spread out physically today, just so you know. Professor Dussel Peters is in Mexico City, and I know Professor Vortherms is at UC-Irvine, but Ron Kind is here in Wisconsin. And so we're great to see all of you. I'm going to start with a sort of a statement of such, and then I'm going to turn to the congressman to see if I'm right about this. You know, despite a lot of other differences, obviously, President Biden has continued President Trump's overall kind of hard line towards Beijing. Like Trump, he thinks that the United States ought to decouple from China, but reduce dependence on products, supply chains. We saw a lot of that, some of the issues during the pandemic, both for economic and national security reasons. And Biden's not alone at all. I think while a lot of people still really favor more trade or continued trade at some levels with China and investment, which is certainly touching both shores, there seems to be some moves to put some distance between the two economies. And I think this is on both sides of the aisle in Congress. And of course, you've served there a while, and of course you have watched through the Trade Committee some of this. So what is your opinion on how accurate that is as an assessment?
Yeah, let me take the first swipe at that. But first of all, Tom, great to see you again, to be with you. And Jeff, thanks for your helping set this up. And delighted to be on the panel with Professor Peters and Professor Vortherms, even though they're not here in the frozen tundra of Wisconsin to enjoy this lovely winter weather that we have back home here. But yeah, China, most important strategic relationship bar none in the 21st century, the U.S.-China relationship, how we deal with that. One of the more complicated relationships that we have, very frustrating. But you're right. I think politically right now, there's growing bipartisan support for the U.S. to get quote unquote tougher against China. That's certainly reflected in the 301 tariffs that the previous administration imposed, and that has been continued under President Biden. I think the global pandemic has really woken a lot of people up in regards to supply chain bottleneck problems. We saw that with basic material we needed to combat this global virus. And we have to develop a better capability of being able to look around the corner and better anticipate supply chain bottlenecks before they have a real economic impact, as we've seen here in the United States, and quite frankly, throughout the globe with increased price pressures, inflation. A lot of that is supply chain disruption related. But I've always believed that the key to China is not for the U.S. to go it alone. we're going to need friends and allies with shared principles, shared values that are willing to stand with us as we stand up to China, asking them to make the structural reforms that we've been demanding for many, many years. Many previous administrations have taken a run at it. My big complaint with the previous administration, President Trump's approach, was this go-it-alone approach of the U.S. trying to act unilaterally by imposing the 301 tariffs, knowing full well there'd be retaliation against us. China, as other countries, know how to hit us where it hurts. Usually it's with agriculture, it's with some of our manufactured products that we try exporting to China. And it did have a devastating impact on the U.S. economy. I mean, here in Wisconsin, Tom, we had record family farm bankruptcies 3 years in a row under the Trump administration. Not all of it was due to the trade war with China, but there was substantial agriculture exports that had just stopped and had nowhere to go. And that definitely had an impact on family farms, not just here in Wisconsin, but throughout the country. I've always been a strong advocate of trying to figure out a path forward for the United States to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. That was one that we were front and center trying to help negotiate. It is now the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement because they've moved on without us. China, by the way, is not a party of that, but interesting enough, they're knocking on the door to become a participating member. And it would be awfully damn silly for the United States to continue to be on the outside looking in on such a substantial, significant trade agreement in the fastest growing economic region in the global economy, the Pacific Rim area. And we're not a party to that. But the reason I think this is key to our relationship with China is because within the TPP framework are the structural reforms that we're demanding China to make with strong enforceability measures. So if we were to join and at some subsequent date, China decides to join, they must adopt those standards that have been negotiated already with TPP and the structural changes that they have to make economically, or they could face significant economic repercussions with the enforcement mechanisms. So I've been talking to the current administration, from the president on a couple of occasions, to his trade ambassador, Catherine Tai, and other like-minded members of Congress. I certainly serve on the trade subcommittee, but I think strategically that makes better sense to me than ramping up a tit-for-tat trade war and what that may ultimately lead to: enhanced conflict, more red lines, more trip points that could invoke armed conflict situations, which wouldn't be good for us, and it wouldn't be good for global stability either. But we can talk about that a little bit later.
Very good. Well, thank you. Let me turn now to our two professors who certainly spent a lot of time studying this, and you know what, some highlights there. Congressman's saying, hey, we can't go it alone. What are your thoughts on that? And second, we need to engage more in that Pacific Rim because of growth and the growing alliances that are there. All of that seems to make some sense. Let me start with Enrique. What are your thoughts on this? And we'll go to Samantha as well.
Okay, again, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's an honor to be here with these panelists. I think it is important to remember a little bit of the recent background of this great power competition and of this decoupling discussion between the United States and China. No? What are the reasons behind these discussions? No? And the reasons are, I believe, that you suddenly have, well, or not so suddenly, you have a new heavyweight, no? which is China in the 21st century. For some countries, researchers, politicians, this was surprising, no? Although China always existed, no? But it has not been analyzed sufficiently, and for many people, it is suddenly a big surprise that China exists, etc. I remind you, for the first time in 2017, in this national security strategy paper by the Trump administration, the administration recognizes China and this great power competition. No? It is not irrelevant to remember also that there is an increasing distrust in the United States of its population vis-a-vis China. No? If you follow the Pew polls, for example, this is the justification, if you want to, for a continuity between or from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, the popular distrust and something is cooking in China vis-a-vis the United States. I would finally simply highlight that the background in this great power competition is, of course, that that the United States has found again a heavyweight economy that is head-to-head competing with the United States and competing at all levels, no? At the micro level, at the firm level, if you follow the AmCham in China, for example, no? And so AmCham in China says Chinese firms, as Loretta Napoleoni highlights, Chinese communists are generating very competitive firms. No? I'm not saying that China is outcompeting the United States in all global value chains, but yes, in some. No? And this is troublesome for many firms at the firm level. But China also presents, and this is in many times forgotten in the United States, presents also an alternative development model, no, based on the public sector, and also an alternative political model, no. And China in the since 2013, with the Belt and Road Initiative, proposes a globalization process with Chinese characteristics. No? So it is not only an economic competition process at the micro level, no, regarding electric vehicles, no, but also at the profound political and development model for third countries, which is at least as relevant in countries such as Mexico and Latin America, and of course in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Enrique. Professor Samantha, decoupling is a pretty tall order, right? You know, the relationship between China and the United States is sort of, in some ways, dates back to the Nixon year. It's about 50 years old in terms of the current modern relationship, right? So what does decoupling mean? I mean, is it less trade, higher tariffs, more onshoring of manufacturing here, severing ties with Chinese firms that may produce surveillance equipment, taking a harder line on Taiwan and its continued independence from the mainland? Probably a combination of those things, but they all come with risk and rewards. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was going to shift us towards decoupling also in response of to the initial question, because I would echo a lot of the sentiments that Representative Kind put forward of how decoupling kind of weakens our stance, that we've had a lot more success by engagement and influence through engagement rather than stepping away. But it's not only this broad perspective of engaging or disengaging, but the fact that decoupling is so difficult. So from just to give you the background of my perspective, a lot of my research right now looks at the consequences of the trade war and what firms are doing in China in reaction to the trade war. And what we're seeing is that we're not seeing that decoupling. We're not seeing the U.S. firms leaving China and coming back to the States. And speaking of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, their surveys nowadays are showing that most firms are just looking to diversify within China because the market is so valuable that it overcomes the costs that come in from these trade wars. And so decoupling itself is a very difficult and in many ways probably impossible process to try to kind of push for, to hope for. What we get instead is some distributional consequences of these policy tools. So many of the large firms are sticking it out. They're finding cheaper ways of producing in China, or they're passing the costs on to consumers rather than actually disengaging from the market. So those processes are much less effective, we'll say, at trying to develop industry outside of China. Personally, I'm a big proponent of engagement and influence through engagement rather than disengagement, because this whole process of decoupling is just so complicated and not really feasible for most of these firms.
Mhm. So in essence, we can talk about decoupling, but the firms that are already there with all kinds of sunk costs, long-term relationships, supply chains within a massive country like China, they're not moving in that direction is the sense of your research at this point.
Exactly. The trade war itself has increased exits coming of foreign firms operating in China, leaving China, but they're largely very small firms and ones that had just been set up in the last couple of years. Larger firms are more likely to just stay, to stick it out, to rely on those other resources that they do have. And U.S. firms are only marginally more likely to leave than non-U.S. firms during the trade war. So we're not seeing this this kind of reshoring hope of U.S. companies leaving.
Mm-hmm. Congressman Kine, back to you for a quick reaction to that. We can, talk about decoupling and maybe there are certain steps that Congress and/or the president could take, but is it really is it realistic to think that this would happen in a big way? Oh, I think you're muted.
There we go. Just wanted to make sure you didn't get my background noise back here. But listen, I appreciate what Professor Vortherms is recognizing right now. There has been hesitancy as far as leaving the China market. But I think there's a couple distinctions that we have to make here. In large part, a lot of these multinational corporations are set up in China specifically for the China domestic market, that they want access to it. They want to sell to that huge consumer base there. And that's kind of the capitalist way of looking at things. But I think we also need to, as far as our own national security interests, start distinguishing those vital products that are essential for our national security, let alone our competitiveness, and whether it makes sense that we're allowing the outsourcing of that R&D and product development and manufacturing to be primarily based in China. Now, I'm thinking obviously of the semiconductor industry, and that is what is powering the 21st century global economy. And we've put ourselves in a position of becoming very dependent on other countries to produce these semiconductors that is vital, not only for our national security, but for all things communication-wise with the advent of the internet and the automobile fleet. And you just go down the list of things that are semiconductor based. So I'm glad that President Biden has been out there highlighting some of the success stories recently. New plant going up in Ohio, one down in Texas. The need to be able to do more of that here domestically. But let's face it, at the end of the day, trade has always been a two-way street, and our farmers are going to want to continue to be able to export the product that they're producing to countries like China, which have many people who are hungry and they need to be fed. And Tom, through the years, I've always been fond of saying that to me, trade is more than just goods and products and services crossing border. It's an important part of our national security and our diplomatic toolbox. It's the relationship you're able to develop with other countries, a lot of that based on mutually beneficial trade agreements. And I've been a forceful advocate of making sure that we have good trade agreements that reflect our values and reflect our principles, and we can bring the rest of the world around that, first with like-minded nations, but also hopefully influencing countries like China too, and make these trade agreements more worker-centric and more worker-focused rather than just the bottom line and the profit statements that companies look to. So I think there's a way of being able to thread this needle while recognizing there are certain things that's essential for us to do a better job of making ourselves and developing in the R&D and the latest breakthroughs that we'd like to be at the forefront in, but understanding that there can be some win-wins, even with a country like China. And Professor Peters did raise the Belt and Road Initiative too, and that's real, and that's having a huge influence globally in China's footprint globally. But there are some downsides to it as well. I was recently in Africa traveling and met with some of those countries, and a lot of complaints in regards to how China is dealing with Belt and Road. The investment, the loans that are becoming usury, China bringing in their own workers, their own managers to run the operations, them controlling the infrastructure needs of those countries. So that can backfire on them as well. But the point, I think, is this. China's offering that. What are we as a country offering the rest of the world, especially the developing world? What constructive value added are we offering these countries too, so that they're willing to let us in the door and engage in a positive relationship? And that's something I'm afraid we're still grappling with, is just what that future looks like.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And you seem to be echoing, in some ways at least, the notion that engagement is certainly a valuable way to look at this and continue. That's certainly what Professor Vortherms said, and that seems to be a conclusion there from your remarks. I mean, or at least cautious engagement.
Yeah, Tom, I describe it as engagement with eyes wide open, so that we're not being taken advantage of, and that China isn't allowed to continue to cheat and not abide by the rules of global trade. And we've had problems, and we're communicating that with them almost every day. But I'm also a student of economic history, and we've been down the road of isolationism, economic populism before. Certainly the 20s and 30s are one of the most recent example. We saw where that led to global conflict. And a former professor of mine at Harvard, Graham Allison, just came out with a very interesting book that I highly recommend policymakers to take a look at. It's called Destined for War, the Thucydides Trap. And throughout history, when you have an already established global power having to deal with the rise of another global power, his thesis is that it invariably leads to conflict. And you can imagine what that would look like with 21st century weapon capability between the US and China. Something that would not be recommended. Something that we're going to have to work hard to try to avoid. And one way of avoiding that is by creating a mutual relationship, trust but verify, to use President Reagan's term, but one that doesn't cut off those avenues of constructive engagement. And I think trade is still one of those avenues that can produce some win-win situations for the American consumer, the American producer, but also what China needs today too, so that they don't view us as just a hostile power trying to thwart whatever they're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. Professor Peters, back to you. Engagement with eyes wide open. Is that a phrase that resonates with you?
I think I'm very surprised that apparently there is a consensus regarding this decoupling discussion and strategy, that this is not a very intelligent strategy. No, it's a very defensive strategy. No, and the U.S. is somehow behaving like the old guy in the global village. No, and we have a new guy in the global village, which is the China, and which is spending, and it's painting its house, and it's buying a new bicycle, etc. No, and the U.S. is not necessarily willing to share some of the benefits with the new rich guy in town. No, again, a decoupling strategy runs against what the United States has been doing in the last century, since the Second World War. This is even ideologically, globally, from a strategic perspective, very difficult to discuss with other partners. No, at our center, we have been discussing a lot this concept of new triangular relationships, no, which means we will have to get used in the next decades to tensions between the US and China. And what does this mean for third countries, no? From Mexico to Vietnam to Germany to whatever, no? So if we agree that this decoupling strategy is very defensive and leaves a wide room open for China, no? Against unilateralism, against or approving free trade, multilateralism, etc., which is very funny to put it somehow, no? That suddenly China is the free trade proponent, no? And as Ron Kind was saying, and putting countries such as Mexico in a very difficult situation, no? Because suddenly China says, my friend, we want to be part of CPTPP, you know, and Mexico was waiting for the US, but the US never came, no? And so difficult situation. So engagement, I think in general, yes, it could be a good catchword. You have to make this much more concrete. But what we have to learn in the next decades, also in the United States, I think, is to be much more pragmatic, no? And see case by case issues, no? And not a holistic ideological perspective in which suddenly the US says we have to produce all processes of each global value chain. That is impossible. No, as proposed by the White House recently, no, with this document of building resilient supply chains in 4 supply chains, but very probably most of them. This is providing China with very strong arguments to initiate a very open process of import substitution. I told you so. The United States is not going to supply me with semiconductors. I have to do it by myself. No? It's again, I would invite to a more pragmatic, less holistic view, less ideologically tainted. But this is not easy. No?
Yeah, no, not easy. Well, and let me bring this back to our hemisphere here for a second in terms of, I'm going to turn back to Professor Samantha on this. For starters, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement is now in place. Congressman Kind, I think you voted for that, and you know, it's had bipartisan support pretty much along the way. What would decoupling, and I think we're beginning to see that maybe decoupling might not happen as some people would tend to characterize it. But what does this change in relationship with China mean potentially for Canada, United States, and Mexico in terms of, you know, these major elements? Trade right now, by the way, our trade deficit is huge, you know, bringing companies back, bringing certain jobs back. We talked about semiconductors. I think we're maybe top 10 in semiconductor production. Most of the big ones are in the Pacific Rim. So what does it mean for USMCA?
So I'm pivoting slightly, right? Because my expertise is in the Chinese political economy world, but I know that there's research coming out of a group associated with Princeton that shows that the kind of the souring relations between the US and China has actually increased trade amongst the rest of the world. And so it is kind of diversified some of the trade connections outside of the US-China direct connection. And so what this means is that by developing these other trade relationships, kind of goes hand in hand with the policies that we currently have. So I would expect to see more trade along these lines, and its distributional impact, especially, you know, from the Chinese perspective, is going to be based on this issue of substitutability, just how easily can products be substituted or alternative sources be found, right? There's a lot of attention on Vietnam, for example, of can Chinese producers go to Vietnam and then trade around the around trade war restrictions, those types of things. But the bottom line for all of these processes is that it's actually increasing and diversifying trade networks outside of just this kind of bilateral relationship. For me personally, outside of research, I think that these broader multilateral moves are positive, and they help the, trying to advance US economic interests is on the one hand worrying about what other people are doing, but also worrying about what we're doing as well, right? So what's going on within in our own industry developments. And so I see that these types of other multilateral agreements are a boon to those types of connections.
And very good. And that connects again back to what Congressman Kind said about, not going it alone. And that's usually the way to get things done. Well, what about Europe and all of this? The European Union, and I'll open this up to everybody in terms of, do they see the rift between China and the United States as an opening? Do they see it as troublesome? Let me start with the congressman on that, and then I'd love to hear from both professors too, in terms of what you're hearing, reading, and seeing.
Yeah, Tom, I'm glad you're bringing the EU into this conversation, because I was going to pivot to that regardless. They play such a fundamental role in all this, not only with our relation to the EU, but what they're doing now with China and the enhanced trade ties that China's been working very hard to try to establish throughout the European Union. It's one of the reasons I'm heading over to London actually next week, is for further trade discussions and where we're heading with all of this. But it's especially been problematic given the closer ties between Germany and China. We know that where Germany goes, they tend to punch above their weight when it comes to the European Union and the influence that has. The irony of what Putin is doing with Ukraine right now, it's re-solidifying the basic principles on which NATO has been founded, and the reason why we need to be relying on each other with good relations in order to stand up to tyranny, in this instance, Russia's encroachment with the sovereignty of Ukraine. And that spills over into the trade relations then as well. But I think for too long, we've taken the European Union for granted. Certainly that was true in the previous administration, where President Trump couldn't go out of his way fast enough to insult our allies, to insult NATO, to insult the European Union. And when you're being called names, you tend not to like that very well. And that does have an effect on trade relations, diplomatic, national security relations. So I'm glad President Biden now has pivoted from that very hostile attitude of the previous administration. And we're recognizing those core values that we do share with our European friends and allies, starting with the fundamental of democracy and human rights. And that too has an influence on where trade relations need to go. But I still think Germany is very much a jump ball in regards to which way they're tilting. They've established some very deep economic ties with China. They become very dependent energy-wise with Russia, as we've been hearing nonstop for the last couple of months with Nord Stream 2. And I think they're in need of a little more care and feeding from our point of view, I believe. But now what's interesting is the UK's breaking off their relationship with the EU through Brexit and going it alone themselves. We've lost, I think, a very valuable ally and a strong voice in regards to our relationship within the EU by the British not being there anymore. And we're still wrestling with what that new relationship is going to look like absent Great Britain from the EU. And the need now for us to engage at a much more deeper, more fundamental level with the other European Union nations when it comes, especially our trade relations with them.
This is only slightly off topic, but would you say that Putin's actions in and around Ukraine are helping to bring together the EU? And it was something of a fractured sort of scene there.
Yeah, he very much, I think, has misread that response from the European Union, NATO, us in particular. And, this is something that, George Kennan warned us about, the father of containment, Russia's paranoia. And even after the Cold War, when the wall collapsed, he was still advising that we need to be a little bit cautious in how far we want to push those boundaries towards Russia and what their response may be. And, you know, Putin's an old KGB guy, and the paranoia runs deep with him. And he's trying to reestablish the old Soviet spheres of influence throughout Eastern Europe. But the more he's pushing, the more it's consolidating that alliance of the democracies who are willing to stand up to him. Now, we haven't been called yet to react with economic sanctions. Again, it's another reason I'm heading over there to further those discussions to make sure we're on the same page. But at the end of the day, Putin risks overplaying his hand terribly with Ukraine, and the response it's garnering from the Baltic nations, from Poland, Romania, Hungary. And so I think one way to seal that deal is for him to introduce troops into Ukraine right now. And he's going to end up with a much bigger problem as far as the democracies and which way that they're leaning than what he had before he generated this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, let me turn back to both professors now. The EU question, how does that factor in to what's going on in our hemisphere vis-a-vis China, and how they might view it from the EU perspective? Let's see. I'll start with Samantha.
So, and I can tell you in terms of the trade war is that one thing that we wanted to test, my co-author and I, Jack Jong at University of Kansas, we wanted to know if US allies were more likely to kind of rally around the flag and also leave, because a lot of the political rhetoric coming out of the previous administration really suggested that this was a goal. And we find that that's just not true. A lot of US allies are staying at an even higher rate than American firms are through this period of increased political risk. So I think that this issue of drawing a line in the sand and expecting people to kind of sort themselves along it is not in line with the economic incentives of the situation. And so greater engagement and more, again, this balance of positive versus negative, going towards the positive side to deepen ties with the European Union in the interest of American economic industry, I think is the other side of the coin that we have to spend just as much time on, if not more time on.
Mm-hmm. All right. Professor Peters.
I see. I'm not a specialist on Europe and China, but it will be an interesting case and example in terms also of seeing how flexible the Biden administration is. No, it is very easy to say we're going to find allies, and to see who is going to stand behind the flag. No, but of course, if you are looking for allies, you will also have to negotiate on particular issues. The issue of decoupling in Germany is not an important discussion. No? I mean, Volkswagen today is selling more cars in China than in Germany. Decoupling from China, Volkswagen will tell you, I don't understand the question. No? So the issue is not completely irrelevant, and you will see in the European Union and in Germany a more flexible stand and discussion. By the way, and shifting to the issue of NAFTA and USMCA, no? Again, here you will see interesting other regional discussions and countries that in principle might be interested to join the United States in the discussion, but very difficult. No? China is Mexico's second trading partner for more than 20 years. So decoupling from China, everybody will tell you, I don't understand the question. No? First of all, no? And secondly, this will also require a deeper discussion in the United States. Surprisingly, USMCA was one of the only trade agreements in the last 5 years that the United States renewed with Mexico and Canada. But very surprisingly, I mean, since 2000, USMCA or NAFTA has been increasingly disintegrating the share of Mexico and Canada in US trade. In 2021, we just received the last data from the Department of Commerce of the United States, has reached pre-NAFTA levels. No, we had the high integration process until 99, 2000, 2001, and then you have the China participation in NAFTA and in US trade. No, if you want to commit to USMCA and other members joining a China group, no. The United States will have to commit to a negotiation with the European Union or with NAFTA and Mexico and Canada in very concrete terms. No, this today has not happened yet. No?
Mm-hmm. Very good.
And Tom,
Well,
if I
thank
can just
you.
quickly interject, I agree with Professor Peter, and I think that's one of the reasons it was so important for us to modernize NAFTA and bring it into the 21st century and have a mutually agreeable trade pact that's going to work for all three nations. Let's face it, there are two border nations. There are two biggest trading partners that we have. It's an incredibly vitally important relationship that we have. We're never going to solve the southern border immigration issue unless we have stronger economies to the south of us. That's just a fact. And so much of this is about building walls and the technology that intercept people before they cross the border. I think we're just missing the target completely when we're not talking about strengthening the Triangle region and the Mexican economy and the disparity that comes from that and why so many people want to cross our southern border to begin with. But back to the EU, just to highlight an example of the complexity of the relationship today. Now I'm going to be visiting one of British's larger steel manufacturing plants. It's China owned today. China owns that plant. Now we don't import a lot of steel from Great Britain, mainly in the specifications area of our security aeronautics industry. So it is very important, but it just shows you the complexity of the economic interdependence now that China has throughout the world. And we need to better understand that and what position we're putting other countries in if we're just going to show up and ask them to choose sides, because that will not be an easy decision for them to make.
Oh, yeah. Well, absolutely. Foreign direct investment is a big part of what is going on in the United States as well, and in Wisconsin. I mean, if you go back a century or century and a half, I mean, that was a factor in Wisconsin's development back in the day. I want to get to some of our audience questions pretty quickly here, and there's some really good ones. But this is for Representative Kine. One of your colleagues, Mike Gallagher, was behind one of the leaders on the Endless Frontier Act. That's morphed into a couple different things. There's the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act that passed the Senate. There's the act that passed the House the other day, the American Competitiveness Act. And I assume out of this will be a conference committee. But it gets back to what Professor Peters said earlier. A lot of this is just about old-fashioned competition. There's a new kid on the block, and everybody has to be a little better about competing. What is your sense of the room in terms of whether a conference committee can pass something out that helps in U.S. competitiveness, R&D, and manufacturing?
Yeah, Tom, this is going to get done. Obviously, there's wide bipartisan support for it coming out of the Senate. I wish we had more Republican support in the House with our American Competes version of it, but the differences will be reconciled, and we're going to be able to get something to the president's desk soon. But, the major focus of this was dealing with the shortage of the semiconductor capacity in the United States. So we're going to be $50 billion in resources devoted to stepping that up so that we're producing more of that and become more self-reliant. That makes sense on so many different levels. But another strong feature of it, especially the House-passed version, is the reinvestment we need to be making as a country in the STEM areas: science, technology, engineering, math. And this isn't anything new, Tom. You may recall during the previous Bush administration, we had this National Academy of Sciences report that came out called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which highlighted how the United States was falling behind with our economic competitiveness, especially in the STEM studies. So the Democratic majority in Congress joined forces with the Bush administration to then pass the American Competes Act in order to reinvest in these crucial areas so that we could stay on the cutting edge of new discoveries and new breakthroughs in science and medicine and technology. And we still need to do that because I, for one, sleep a little better at night knowing that we as a nation with our value system is on the cutting edge of these new scientific and medical discoveries and breakthroughs, and not necessarily a country like China that plays by different rules when it comes to human rights and civil liberties and the privacy protections that consumers naturally demand. And so I think this is an important piece of legislation. It's not going to solve all the challenges or all the problems, but I think it does send important market signals that we are serious about standing up a better semiconductor industry domestically ourselves, while still being able to rely on some key allies like Taiwan that we import a lot of semiconductors from today. But I think, again, it's another example of the growing bipartisan recognition that we as a country need to up our game when it comes to dealing with the competitiveness of China today.
Mm-hmm. By the way, this is an aside, but there is a Wisconsin connection to Taiwan Semiconductor, a big one. Mike Splinter from Horicon, Wisconsin originally, and then was a part of Building Applied Materials, is on their board of directors. So it's kind of again, getting back to the fact of the interconnections within the world.
Right.
Professor Vortherms, I'm going to turn to you with a question from an audience member. What industries are most committed to continuing their investments in China? Are there certain sectors that are more committed than others?
Yeah, so looking at which sectors moved, which sectors had the largest exit increase versus the smallest increase, the largest increase came from finance. So a lot of foreign financial firms left the country, so a very highly mobile industry and one that faces a lot of regulations. The industries that are the least likely to be influenced to exit have been firms working in the power sector, so like electric, gas, and water power sector in China. So those are clearly also focusing on the domestic market in China, but also the manufacturing sector. So the whole manufacturing sector was the second to least likely to leave, and the primary sector as well, the agriculture, forestry, and animal husbandry. Those are all sectors that are quite stable, we'll say. The largest industry, so many of these sectors are quite small in terms of numbers of firms. The largest that has a higher rate of exit is the transport, storage, and postal services sector. So that represents a large number of firms that have a relatively high exit rate, and you would expect that in trade disruptions, right? Because that's where the margins are going to be just a little bit more expensive and fewer alternative sources for them.
Okay, very good. Thank you. We got a couple of questions that are really kind of tied into the China and human rights. We're seeing that right now an Olympics that pretty much ran the way China wanted it to run. I mean, this took place under conditions that they more or less set, which makes you wonder about decoupling when this whole Olympic thing carried out as it is. But there's questions about the Uyghurs, other things that involve China and human rights. How does that play into this discussion? Maybe the congressman could start.
Yeah, Tom, let me first take a crack at it. Listen, I was fully supportive of the diplomatic boycott of China in respect to the Olympics, but I've also been a big believer, if there's going to be some decoupling somewhere, let's decouple the tensions nations may share with one another from the spirit of the Olympic athletes. And let's let them go and let them compete under that banner. And And I think we're walking that fine line pretty well in light of the Winter Olympics in China today. But we're also not giving them a free pass. We've been very critical of their treatment of the Uyghur population out west and the genocidal practices that they've been. And we've been marshaling an international response to that as well. And China is loath to receive that type of criticism, but they need to hear it, that we are paying attention. And we've passed resolutions now in Congress in light of that too. But back to the whole decouple movement with China, there are certain aspects of China's future that we need them to succeed at. I'm thinking primarily in the area of climate change. They're not going to be able to do this on their own. And there are ways for us to engage with China in a constructive fashion, easing the transfer of environmental technology, for instance, to China so that we can help them wean themselves off from their dependence on fossil fuels. We could do everything right here at home, but if we don't get those larger emitters throughout the globe, China, India, Brazil, as examples, to also succeed on this, then the battle's lost. We've lost the race against climate change and the devastating impact it's going to have. So I think there are, again, some opportunities for constructive engagement with China. China knows what direction they need to go in as well. But it's going to be very difficult, those transition, as we're finding it ourselves in this country. But I've never also been one of those politicians who say, woe is us when it comes to China's rise. China is a country with deep problems, from a rapidly aging population and whether or not they can grow rich before they grow old. I think the verdict is still out on that. They're very carbon dependent economically, and they're choking on the smog. We've sponsored a Chinese student here in America ever since 8th grade. We live him. He's like a third son in our family, a proud graduate of Madison right now. But he was into cross country racing in high school in lacrosse. And when he went home for the summer before his senior year, he came back and I asked him, I said, Oscar, how much running, how much training were you able to do back home? He said, not a day, because the pollution was so bad that they couldn't exercise outside. And I'm thinking, my God, they're sacrificing a whole generation, their future, because they can't get a grip on the environmental problems that they have. So there are a lot of challenges that China is facing at the same time. And this is not preordained that we are going to be playing second fiddle to them. But I think there are ways for us to be constructively helpful to them with some of the big challenges that they face at the same time.
Very good. Professor Peters, let me get back to you for some thoughts on this.
Yes, regarding this last issues, I think many of us are waiting for the strategy of the Biden administration vis-a-vis China. It is good that you want to look for allies in Europe, in London, in Mexico, but there has to be a coherent strategy that has not been discussed as that until today. Maybe we will not have it because it's too complex, but you have the results of the trade truce, and the Biden administration will have to see what it does with the results. According to Chad Bown and others, well, the results are far from expectations. But U.S. Representative Ron Kind, I have a question for you in terms of the different initiatives of the U.S. vis-a-vis China. In the Congress, in the Senate, you have been mentioning some of this regarding trade, competitiveness, etc. I still have the very strong impression, Representative, that the United States still has the idea that it can go alone against China, although you are looking for allies. But when you want to build resilient supply chains, when you want to build infrastructure, etc., the regional aspect, for example, of USMCA, never appears. It's the United States. The United States wants to build the full global value chain of semiconductors. And when you see auto parts, automobiles, electronics, you cannot understand the United States if you do not explicitly include Canada and Mexico. There is a tension there. Sometimes it's the US alone, and then suddenly USMCA appears. How
Sure.
does this work today?
Yeah, let's hear from the congressman on that, and then I want to get back to Professor Vortherms.
It's a great question, Professor Peters. And listen, I'm not announcing any secrets here when I say that neither political party in the United States wants to appear soft on China today, just politically. I mean, the optics, it's difficult. And yet I do commend the Biden administration for the outreach effort that they've made in establishing a coalition, again, of our closest friends and allies, like-minded nations, on what the best approach will be in addressing China's rise in this century. Again, one of the reasons why we felt it was important to modernize NAFTA with the new USMCA trade agreement was to strengthen those economic ties, to create more win-win situations, to address certain aspects of the NAFTA agreement that was forgotten or neglected at the time, such as enhanced worker rights, environmental standards and protections, the enforceability provisions, a new digital chapter that obviously didn't exist during the creation of the first NAFTA trade agreement. Now that preceded my time by just about a year and a half, so I wasn't there during the deliberations with NAFTA, but I was heavily involved in the negotiations with USMCA to make sure that we had a strong Northern Hemisphere economic sphere that could create some really strong win-win relationships across the border. And also part of this was done in the context of immigration policy. And we're still tied up into knots in this country when it comes to immigration flows and how we're going to best address it. And I don't think we can do that by divorcing the economic reality south of our border. But I think the Biden administration's instincts are correct here, that now is the time for us to strengthen our alliances, not insult them. And we've had a lot of damage repair from the previous 4 years, and President Trump's rhetoric did not go over well. But at some point, and I agree with you on this, the Biden administration is going to need to start clarifying what that strategy is going to look like, our relationship with China, but also how it does involve our other allies, starting with Mexico and Canada, our two border neighbors. So we'll look forward to continuing those conversations.
Okay, very good. And again, I think an example of where, well, maybe USMCA is a blueprint for how we approach this in less than a unilateral way. Agriculture, what is the latest there, and how would decoupling help or hurt in terms of agricultural trade? As you noted, there were a number of farms that closed in Wisconsin, maybe, but anyway, let me take that to you, and I also want to hear from Professor Vortherms on this.
Yeah, well, obviously, Wisconsin agriculture economy, Tom, you're no stranger how important that is, not just with the producers themselves, but the entire economic infrastructure that comes from agriculture. It still produces more jobs directly or indirectly than any other industry we have as a state. China has been a big market, for us to export our surplus product. They need it. They have a lot of hungry people over there. So again, there's that win-win situation. But when we take unilateral action, as we saw under the Trump administration with the imposition of the 301s, China knew how to retaliate and knew where to hurt us the most. And it was with agriculture. It was some of our advanced manufacturing that was heading to China in the form of exports. And it did have an economic impact. The phase one trade agreement has not lived up to its billing. China pulled up way short when it came to the purchases that they had agreed to under the phase one. That too is complicating the approach of the Biden administration with China, what you can trust them to do. I mean, if they weren't going to live up to the terms of that agreement, then how far are you willing to continue to try to foster this relationship by easing the 301s, for example? So it has been a little bit frustrating, China's response, but also the lack of clarity. Now we're 1 year into this administration. I was willing to give them some time in order to get their footing and do the comprehensive review that they said they wanted to do. But now it's time to start putting some plan in action. And I really want to be able to work with the administration and what that looks like. and who all is going to be involved with it, and who, quite frankly, we can rely on when it comes to, again, the type of structural reforms we're asking China to make.
Okay. Professor Vortherms, we've covered a lot of territory here lately, human rights, now agriculture, the effect of USMCA on all this, and some other pieces. So what are your thoughts on, and the environment, by the way. So what are your thoughts on some of those topics? Come
So,
on, it's a lot.
yeah, it's a lot. I'm just thinking of, joking in my mind of these are all topics that I teach in my class on Chinese politics, which I'll be running off to here in just a moment. But I think when we're thinking about all of these like really big issues on what's going on in China, what the role the U.S. can and should play, what's really important to kind of keep in mind is the complexity of the system, not only the complexity of the economic system, but also the complexity of the Chinese system itself, right? When we think about China, we tend to kind of pigeonhole it into a corner of like one giant entity that is often seen as an adversary. But that's actually very harmful to the way that we operate and can create biases that really hurt our own interests. And instead, China is a very complex system that not only has, say, the party, it also has the government, it also has society, all of which have different interests and different represent different possibilities and challenges for engagement and U.S. economic interests. So in dealing with all of these individual questions, it's really important to recognize that the Chinese state is also trying to balance many different competing interests themselves as they try to maintain stability and push forward for economic development in their own way, rather than just kind of painting them as this great adversary that we need to be balancing.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And, getting back to when we were talking about specific industries and foreign direct investment, one of our listeners noted that he's seeing a lot in terms of Chinese acquisitions in paper, printing, pulp, converting, packaging. These are all things that are Wisconsin's strengths, and he's seeing that in Wisconsin. So that's a really interesting observation. So I think we are very close to the closing hour here, and I want to pose a question to all three of you for a quick answer. Decoupling, can it happen in part, fully, or somewhere in between? So kind of can decoupling take place at all, in part, or fully? Professor Vortherms.
So I don't think that decoupling in its traditional sense can really happen, and nor do I think it should happen. You might see shifting, however, but I think that gold standard of decoupling, whatever that actually looks like, is not something that is reasonable.
Okay, very good. Professor Peters.
I think it's a very defensive strategy. I think you have to be not ideologically holistic, but very pragmatic. And you have to work with your allies. We finished last year a very detailed 6-digit level analysis on US imports, considering tensions between the US and China. And we defined 198 activities in which Mexico could integrate to global value chains of the United States. So maybe it's half of it, maybe it's 10, but you have to be very detailed and precise, not ideologically holistic. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Professor Peters. Last word, Congressman Kine.
Well, last word is complexity. And I think this conversation of this last hour really highlighted the complex relationship we do have with the rising power like China. And back to the decoupling question, I think there are going to be certain products that are vital to our national security that we have to have greater self-reliance on, semiconductor industry as a prime example. But China throughout the years has been very good at copying and mass producing, stealing intellectual property, and mass producing. But they've been experiencing some decoupling on their own too, where some of those low-wage jobs have been moving across the border into countries like Vietnam and Thailand. And they're grappling with that shift too that's taking place. But as we move forward, I think there are still some win-win opportunities that can be had. I think trying to isolate China is impractical and would force really tough decisions, even with some of our closest allies to have to make. I just think we need to have a more realistic, forward-leaning, positive view of what we can offer the rest of the world when it comes to our economic policy, but also a country like China, recognizing the tripwires that exist in the relationship and how tenuous the situation is in the South China Sea, for instance, our relationship with Taiwan as an example. But I think other countries are realizing that China is here as a force that's going to have to be reckoned with. And I believe that there's an important role for the United States to provide key leadership on this front.
Okay. Well, maybe if there's a summary today, it's engagement with eyes open. It's be a better competitor and be positive about that. And don't be afraid to forge partnerships and not go it alone. So with that, I'm going to close out on my portion here and go back to my friend Jeff Mayers for any closing comments. Thank you to our esteemed panel for being a part of this great discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you, panelists. This has really been instructive for me. I learned a lot. And Tom, I really appreciate your perspective as head of the Wisconsin Technology Council. So, again, I want to thank our panelists, Congressman Ron Kind, Professor Samantha Vortherms of UC-Irvine, and Professor Peters in Mexico City. Really appreciate your viewpoints and the conversation, really instructive for everybody. So this has been our first of the year, our first trade policy event of the year. If you have ideas for others, please message me directly to Mayers, M-A-Y-R-S, @wispolitics.com. This has been a production of wispolitics.com, wisbusiness.com, and the Wisconsin Technology Council. I want to thank our sponsors, Michael Best Strategies and the Wisconsin District Export Council. Also, the partners for this program today, the International Practice section of the Wisconsin State Bar, the Center for East Asian Studies, the Wisconsin Technology Council, the World Trade Association, Madison International Trade Association, and the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies at UW-Madison. It's been a great program. We'll have this, a recording of this available at our website by tomorrow. And so this is Jeff Mayers signing off for now. Thank you very much for tuning in.